It was a Tuesday night in late 1990, somewhere past midnight, and the recording studio on Sunset Boulevard had that specific kind of quiet that only happens when something important is about to go wrong. Whitney Houston stood at the microphone. She'd been in that booth for 3 hours. The headphones sat slightly crooked on her head, the way they do when you've adjusted them a dozen times, looking for a comfort that isn't coming. She was tired. Not just body tired, the kind of tired that builds up from years of being exactly what everyone else needs you to be, every single day, without a single crack showing. She took a breath. She started singing. And then Stevie Wonder said, "Stop." Not loudly. That's the thing people don't understand about that moment. He didn't shout it or slam his hand on the piano keys. He just said it. Calm, quiet, final. The way a surgeon says, "Scalpel." Everyone in that room froze. The engineer behind the glass. The backup musicians sitting on folding chairs. Whitney pulled the headphones down around her neck. She looked through the glass at Stevie. He was sitting at the studio's grand piano, his dark glasses angled slightly upward, his face completely still. "You're singing the notes," he said, "but I can't feel your soul." If you've never had someone you deeply admire say something that precise and that painful at exactly the right moment, you won't fully understand what happened next. Whitney didn't argue. She didn't laugh it off. She just stood there, and something moved across her face that the engineer later described as watching a person realize something they'd been trying not to know for a very long time. She turned away from the glass, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all. If you've been watching this channel, you already know that stories like this never start where they seem to start. So make sure you subscribe and hit the bell, because what happened next in that room is something that almost nobody knows. The truth is, Whitney Houston had been carrying something heavy into every recording studio she'd walked into for the past 5 years. It wasn't self-doubt. She didn't have that, not in the conventional sense. What she had was something more complicated. She had the weight of a perfect image that had been built so carefully for so long that it had started to feel like a cage with very expensive locks. Think about where she was in 1990. She'd already had 7 consecutive #1 singles. 7, a record that didn't exist before her. Clive Davis, the man who had signed her to Arista Records back in 1983, had shaped her sound with the precision of a watchmaker. Every note calculated, every arrangement designed to position her as the undeniable, crossover, everybody's darling pop princess. And it had worked. God, had it worked. But working and feeling right are two very different things. Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, had raised her daughter in the Baptist church in Newark, New Jersey. Gospel was the language Whitney learned to speak before she ever learned pop music. Those old church songs, raw, imperfect, surrendered, that was where her voice had first understood what it was capable of. Not in a concert hall, not in a recording booth. In a church where the paint was peeling off the walls and people cried openly, and nobody worried about whether their voice was too big for the room. And then the industry found her. And the industry loved what it heard. But the industry also had opinions about what too much looked like. And somewhere in the years between Newark and superstardom, Whitney had learned to manage herself, to perform instead of feel, to deliver technically immaculate vocal runs that left audiences breathless, while keeping the deepest, most unguarded part of herself locked somewhere far from the microphone. She was brilliant at it. That was the tragedy. She was so brilliant at delivering the polished version that most people couldn't tell anything was missing. Stevie Wonder could tell. He had been asked to collaborate on the project as a favor, the kind that only happened when musicians still made music by being in the same room together. He had sat at that piano and listened to Whitney run through the song 3 times. Each take was technically stunning. Each take landed in the same place, beautiful on the surface, somehow closed underneath. Now, what most people don't know about Stevie Wonder is that he processes sound differently than sighted musicians. When you can't rely on visual cues, the expression on a singer's face, the body language that tells you someone is holding back, you develop an almost preternatural sensitivity to what's actually happening in a voice. He heard things in Whitney that the engineer's meters couldn't measure. He heard the door that was almost open, but not quite. And that's what he was pointing at when he said she was singing the notes without her soul. He wasn't being cruel. He was being the most honest person in the room. He was saying, I can hear the hallway, but you won't let me through the door. But here's the thing about Whitney Houston in 1990. Nobody said that to her. Nobody. Not since she'd broken through. The people around her told her she was perfect. The reviews told her she was perfect. The chart positions told her she was perfect. And when the only feedback you receive for years is some version of, don't change a thing, you start to build an identity around that immobility. So when Stevie said stop, what hit her wasn't just the critique, it was the recognition. It was somebody finally seeing the gap between what she was giving and what she actually had, and caring enough to say something about it out loud. She stood with her back to the glass for what felt like a full minute. The engineer later said he genuinely didn't know what was going to happen. He'd seen sessions fall apart over less. He had his hand near the intercom button, ready to say something neutral and professional, but then he didn't, because something in the stillness told him this wasn't a session falling apart. This was a session becoming something else. Whitney turned back around. She put the headphones back on. She looked straight through the glass at Stevie, who hadn't moved from the piano bench, whose posture was perfectly patient, like someone who had all night and knew it. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, and then she closed her eyes. What happened in the next 47 seconds is the kind of thing that sounds exaggerated when you try to describe it in words. Because the words that exist for singing, powerful, emotional, stunning, have been used so many times for so many mediocre things that they've lost their ability to carry real weight. So let me try to tell you what people in that room actually experienced, rather than what the words say. The engineer said the first thing he noticed was his own hands. He became aware of them gripping the edge of the mixing board, not because he decided to grip it, but because his body had made that decision without asking him. The two session musicians sitting behind him, guys who had played on hundreds of recordings and had heard everything, one of them put his face in his hands, not to cry, just because he didn't know what else to do with it. And Stevie Wonder, the man who had asked her to find her soul, sat completely still at the piano. His head dropped slowly forward, and then his shoulders started to shake. He was weeping. Not because the performance was sad, because it was true. Because after years of hearing Whitney Houston sing with the precision of someone who had mastered the instrument and the distance of someone who'd learned to protect herself with that mastery, she had finally just let go. The door opened, and what came through it was something that didn't have a category. It was the church. It was Newark. It was Sissy Houston and all those Sunday mornings and every gospel riff Whitney had ever stored in her body without being given permission to use it in a pop studio. It was grief and it was joy, and it was the specific texture of a human being who has spent years being told they're perfect, finally understanding that perfection was never the point. When she finished, the booth was silent. Then the engineer, without thinking, started clapping, alone in the control room, clapping at a monitor. One of the session musicians said "my God" under his breath, quietly enough that he might not have known he'd said it at all. Stevie took off his glasses. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyes. Then he turned his face toward the booth, toward where her voice had just been. And he said something that nobody in that room forgot. He said, "That's who you are." Not "great take," not "let's listen back." 4 words that had nothing to do with the recording and everything to do with the woman who had just made it. Whitney stood in the booth with her eyes still closed for a moment longer. Then she opened them. And the people who were there that night said that whatever had been tight in her face when she walked in, whatever careful architecture she'd been maintaining, was gone. She looked lighter. She looked, for the first time in longer than she could probably remember, like herself. The session wrapped quietly after that, not because the energy left the room, but because everyone understood instinctively that you don't follow a moment like that with more work. You let it breathe. Stevie and Whitney talked for a while at the piano before they left. No one recorded what they said. It wasn't that kind of conversation. In the years that followed, Stevie mentioned Whitney Houston in interviews with a reverence different from how he spoke about other artists. He didn't talk about her range or her technical gifts. He talked about her capacity, Something inside her voice he described as inexhaustible. Something most singers spend their entire careers looking for and never find. He knew. He had been in the room. And Whitney, for her part, carried that night with her. The people closest to her noticed a shift in the months that followed, a loosening of something, a willingness to take risks in the studio that hadn't always been there before. Some of the most emotionally devastating vocal performances she ever committed to tape came after 1990. Whether that was coincidence or whether it had something to do with a Tuesday night when a blind man heard her holding back and refused to pretend otherwise, only she could have said for certain. What that night was really about wasn't a recording session. It wasn't even about the music, not entirely. It was about the specific human cost of being excellent for so long, in so public a way, that you start to mistake the performance for the person. Whitney Houston had been performing perfection for years, and it took someone who literally couldn't see the performance, who could only hear the truth underneath it, to reach through and call her back to herself. That's what Stevie gave her in that room. Not a critique, a mirror, and the courage to look into it. There is a version of Whitney Houston that the world got. The polished, breathtaking, record-breaking voice that sold out stadiums and made grown men cry at award shows. And then there is the version that lived underneath that, the one from Newark, the one Sissy raised in the church, the one that came out in full for 47 seconds on a Tuesday night when no cameras were rolling and nobody was keeping score. Stevie Wonder heard both, and he refused to settle for only one of them. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations only to silence them with your true gift? Tell us your story in the comments below.